Here we are, quintessential Australian scene. Obviously it'll fit the topic. I'm going to discuss why I'll be voting yes, the forthcoming Voice to Parliament referendum. Now I know there's a lot of confusion and a lot of misinformation and disinformation, but obviously there are people with different political, ideological, cultural viewpoints as far as the Voice to Parliament is concerned, but I will outline my viewpoint and try to deal with the criticisms which are levied from all aspects of people's opinions and political ideologies. So first of all, what is the Voice to Parliament and why did it come about? Well, the Voice to Parliament is a very simple concept. It's about incorporating an advisory body of First Nations people in the Australian Constitution to advise, and that's the key word, to advise Parliament and the bureaucracy regarding legislation and issues which affect First Nations people. So why did the Uluru Statement from the Heart in 2017, which was a meeting of delegates from around the country, from almost 250 different First Nations groups on the Australian continent and the islands surrounding the Australian continent, why did they make 3 recommendations? And what were those 3 recommendations? Those recommendations were 1, a Voice to Parliament, 2, a truth-telling process, and 3, a treaty. Now the Voice to Parliament, to be incorporated in the Australian Constitution, was a fundamental demand of the Voice to Parliament, of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It had overwhelming support from the delegates, not 100% support, but overwhelming support. And why? Well, most of the people involved in that meeting, in those series of meetings, were well aware of what happened to ATSIC when the Howard government was elected. ATSIC was a representative body of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders which was elected by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, which not only advised government but also allocated resources and finances particular projects around the country. And that body was abolished by Parliament. So First Nations people didn't want that to happen again. And the only way you can prevent Parliament from removing rights and liberties which you believe you have is by incorporating those ideas in the Australian Constitution. Think about it. It's a very simple concept. There is nothing radical or revolutionary about it. Now let's look at the opposition, because there are various opposition forces, both from the Indigenous community and non-Indigenous community, but mainly from the non-Indigenous community. The No campaign has been a rallying call for elements in Australian society who have never accepted that this country was inhabited for over 60,000 years by people, who never accepted the 1992 Marlborough High Court decision, which on the 3rd of June 1992 found that First Nations people had rights to land in law because of the prior occupation of this land. Australia was colonised on the basis of terra nullius. That means the land belonged to no one. And that's how the colonisation process was justified. Now obviously it's become a rallying cry for many people who oppose First Nations people actually having a voice or a treaty or even oppose truth-telling, as we saw in the dark days of the Howard regime, where the brutality of the colonisation process was ignored, marginalised, denied. So 237 years after the colonisation process began in 1788, it's about time that First Nations people had a mechanism via which to influence Parliament, which is the instrument which was created by the colonisers in this country. There's nothing radical about it, nothing revolutionary about it. It doesn't stop the treaty process, and it doesn't stop the truth-telling process. Now, a lot of people say, and this is an opinion which I've heard over and over and over again, which has been spouted by the majority of the Liberal Party, all of the National Party, and significant sections of the Australian community, and that's the key, significant sections of the Australian community, that the voice to Parliament will divide Australians on racial grounds. And it's something that a lot of people believe. Now, the voice to Parliament is not about giving a particular race special privileges. It's about acknowledging the landowners, the traditional, the original landowners of this continent and the islands around this continent. It's about property rights. It's about acknowledging the property rights of First Nations people, as we saw to a lesser degree with the Mabo judgment in 1992. It's not about dividing people on race. It's about acknowledging the descendants of the First Nations people have rights because of their original ownership of this land. It's not about race. Now, many people who identify as First Nations people have a mixed heritage. So really it's not about, even on that basis, it's not about race. It's not about a division based on race. It's a division based on property rights, something which most of the people who oppose the voice to Parliament and are urging you to vote no would understand. Because the whole problem started in 1788 when the east coast of Australia was accessed by the British, who colonised this land. And to colonise this land, it needed to be taken away from the original inhabitants. And it was taken away by force. Simple process. The historical document is there. What happened is, land which was held in common by traditional people was selected by squatters who turned that selection process into freehold title. And today, freehold title is the super glue which holds this country together. In a society based on private investment for private profit, which is based on freehold title to private profit, obviously people who hold freehold title today would want to maintain that title. And it's the same with First Nations people. As the original owners, they need a mechanism via which to influence Parliament, advise the bureaucracy about what best suits their needs, which have occurred as a consequence of the colonisation process. Now, much of the dislocation that we see in First Nations people is directly attributed to the British colonisation process. These problems didn't exist in Indigenous communities before the colonisation began. Now the other furphy, which you'll hear over and over again, that this is an attack on the property rights of Australians. An advisory group to Parliament has nothing to do with freehold title. All it does is it acknowledges the prior occupants of the land. Now, many people, many people oppose a voice to Parliament on principles which are based on race. And the fascinating thing is the people who talk about that the voice to Parliament divides us on race and gives a particular group special privileges are the very people who promote racial division and racial hatred. That's the irony of it. Now, then you've got the more radical elements of the Aboriginal community, not the Torres Strait Islander community, but the Aboriginal community, who oppose the process. They talk about a treaty before a voice, because they claim that they have never ceded sovereignty of the land. Obviously they haven't ceded their sovereign rights to the land, but the fact is that reality is based on the colonisation process, is based on the monopolisation of force by a particular group which has been able to establish itself on this land by defeating and destroying the majority of the original inhabitants. That's the reality. The thing about a referendum is that referendums is the only way that Australians are actually able to change the building blocks. A treaty is an agreement, a relationship between the government of the day and First Nations people. Treaties can be a difficult process to carry out for a variety of reasons, especially in Australia. But when we talk about First Nations people, we're talking about over 250 independent groups. So what do? Does the federal government negotiate with First Nations people as a whole, or does it negotiate with 250 different groups? And as we see in Victoria, where they're trying to negotiate a treaty, the difficulties associated with that process. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a treaty. But whether there's an advisory group incorporated in the Australian Constitution or not has very little to do with a treaty. What it does, if the voice to Parliament is successful, if the referendum is successful, what it does, it creates the momentum towards a treaty, towards truth-telling. No future government is going to embark on a treaty process at the federal level if the voice to Parliament fails. First Nations people don't have the power to overthrow the government of the day. So although they may not have ceded their sovereign rights, the fact is that the colonisation process has imposed a whole series of institutions on this land which people need to work with, interact with. For example, if I don't pay taxes, there is a process in this country which will ensure that I'm bankrupt, and if it means I hold freehold title to land, that land can be removed by the government of the day. That's what a constitution is about. It's about the building blocks. Whether we accept that constitutional arrangement or not is irrelevant. What is relevant is whether the government of the day, whether the state, has a monopoly on the use of force to enforce that constitutional arrangement in this country. The courts, the police, and ultimately the armed forces are there to ensure that the Constitution, which was adopted on the 1st of January 1901, is enforced. So that's the reality that people have to face. Whether you ceded sovereign rights or not is irrelevant. What is relevant is what is happening on the ground today. And for the voice referendum to fail, as I said before, stops the momentum towards creating a treaty. It stops the momentum towards truth-telling. Whether the advisory group, that's the voice to Parliament, has any real influence or not is not the point. The point is it's there. The point is that Australians have accepted that First Nations people were here first and they have rights to land in law, and as property owners they have continuing property rights, which an advisory group incorporates in the building blocks, the Constitution. Now, why is it difficult to change the Constitution in this country? And it's difficult because the process is convoluted and complex. And if we don't have reasonable agreement within political groups and political parties, most constitutional attempts fail. Because you need a majority of people in the country to vote for a particular issue, and more importantly, you need a majority of the states to support that constitutional thrust. And if one of the major states with a significant population votes against the voice to Parliament, the chances are that although other states, there may be a majority of states, there won't be a majority of people that will vote for the voice to Parliament. So it is a difficult bar to jump. And that's why only 11 referendums from over 90 have been successful. Now, governments don't like holding referendums. They only hold referendums when there is enough push from below to force them to hold a referendum. As we see, the last referendum which was held in this country was held almost a quarter of a century ago in 1999 regarding a republic. Now, that referendum failed because the government of the day was able to divide those who wanted a republic on the basis of how that republic would be, who would be the head of state of that particular republic. Would it be appointed by the government of the day or appointed by the people through a ballot box? And that division meant that the Republican referendum failed, and 25 years later we continue to be part of a constitutional monarchy. 6 governors, 1 Governor-General, and theoretically the Governor-General, as we saw in 75, has the power to dismiss an elected government. Just an extraordinary situation. So a quarter of a century later, that Republican debate is dead, irrespective of the death of Elizabeth II and the ascendancy to the throne of Charles III, who's an unpopular monarch compared to his mother. That push for a republic is dead and will continue to be dead because of that failure of that referendum in 1999. And if you want to listen regarding what will happen if the voice to Parliament fails, the journey towards truth-telling will halter. The journey towards a treaty, a significant treaty, between the federal government and this country's First Nations people will stall, and First Nations people will continue to have laws and programs imposed on them which they have no voice in advising the government of the day in the formulation of that legislation. So this is an important referendum. A referendum is the mechanism by which the people of the country make a decision. It is not about government making decisions. It's about instilling into the document, the founding document of this country, the ability for us to move forwards as far as a treaty is concerned, as far as truth-telling is concerned, as far as resolving many of the issues which the colonisation process has caused and continues to cause, not just among First Nations people, but among the rest of us. Because these divisions need to be resolved. And one way to begin resolving this issue is by supporting the voice to Parliament at the forthcoming referendum.